How do we know that the Bible is complete? How do we justify the canon? Faith? Or maybe we just don't, but maybe we can actually simplify it a bit by asking a different question.
How can we know the Protestant canon is true as opposed to the Catholic canon?
The Protestant versus Catholic canon. For centuries, it really wasn't a big issue. Even during the Council of Trent, many in attendance didn't feel that there was a major issue here. But then again, at least when it came to Lutheranism, they still included the Deuterocanonical books. They just didn't hold them up to the same level of full scripture. They were useful, but still less than. And then in the 19th century, Protestant Bibles started to formalize the removal of those extra books, and we've had this question ever since. Which canon is correct? Sure, we are ignoring other canons out there like the Eastern Orthodox canon, but let's keep it narrow right now and see the supposed answer.
Because I'm a Protestant.
So let's be perfectly honest here. That's generally the answer. The Catholic canon fits Catholics really well, and for Protestants, those extra books don't really add anything of import. And either way, the Deuterocanonical books don't really change the overall faith, so it's probably fine.
Up until 1545, give or take, there were 39 and 27, period.
Nope. This is bad history on both accounts, because the Christian Old Testament wasn't always just 39 books, nor was the New Testament just 27 books. It's much more complicated than that. The New Testament is a bit easier. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were debates as to what belonged in the New Testament, but by the 2nd century we largely get the idea that there are just 4 Gospels. That was accepted quite early on. Then we have the letters of Paul, which were accepted early on as well, even though we couldn't always agree on what was by Paul. And kind of the big one was Hebrews. Was the book of Hebrews written by Paul? Well, some people thought so, and others didn't. But even after our basic New Testament was agreed upon, there was still debate about a few texts. There were a few books that were often added to canon lists, such as the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache, that we currently just don't use. Now, moving into the 3rd and 4th century, we see more discussion about what was scripture, and with that discussion came debate. When we look at Eusebius, for example, even though he lists the books of the New Testament as we know it, he also states that some of these books, such as James, Jude, and 2 John, were accepted by many, but they didn't have universal acceptance. He also mentions a handful of books that are accepted by some, but in general are among the rejected writings. These include the Acts of Paul, Epistle of Barnabas, and a variety of different Gospels, among others. The big turning point here is often thought to be Athanasius Festal Letter of 367 AD, where he lists our 27 books of the New Testament. However, this is often overemphasized, as that simply was one canonical list among a variety that were actually circulating around at that time. But the reason that it stands out is because it agrees with our modern canon. Now, while the New Testament canon would eventually stabilize around this list, there would continue to be debates for centuries, with works such as the Shepherd of Hermas and First Clement, for example, continuing to be accepted by different churches throughout the 9th century. At the same time, the Book of Revelation wouldn't be fully accepted until around 1200 AD, when the Armenian Church finally adopted it. So the idea that it was always just 27 books simply is wrong. The Christian Old Testament gets a bit more difficult though, as there were a lot more debates when we're actually considering what belonged. Now, some churches adopted the Septuagint rather early on. Others, such as Catholicism, would actually take the Septuagint, but not the entire thing. A few books would actually be removed, such as 3 and 4 Maccabees. Then there were early church fathers such as Tertullian, who also accepted other books such as Enoch. Now, I've covered this more in depth elsewhere, so I won't belabor the point here, but when we look at canonical lists throughout this time period, while we can find some that line up with the Protestant canon, we also find a variety that, well, there's just a lot of different ones that are circulating. But let's see where this is going, and we can jump in a bit deeper here.
Even Jerome, who translated the Vulgate, Latin translation, he did not believe in.
So I will be the first one to bring up Jerome in a topic like this. But if you're going to do that, you have to understand 2 things. 1, Jerome was just a single person. He didn't exist in isolation. Yes, he compiled the Vulgate, but the Vulgate wouldn't be standardized or see an official version until more than 1,000 years after Jerome. Over these centuries, it would be revised many different times, so we have to be clear on that. Now, 2, he still included the Deuterocanonical books, or at least many of them, in his Vulgate, but he rejected the canonical status of those books. He would say that they were good for reading, but not for doctrine, and then later on he stated that they were apocrypha, which was somewhat negative. And again, Jerome's thoughts were debated by others, and this debate would continue all the way through the 16th century. So he wasn't the end-all here, he was just one voice, a voice that we can point to in order to show that yes, there was debate, but we can't say that his view was the only view or the standard view.
The early church had a standard.
They really didn't. It's why we see so many different canonical lists even among the early church fathers, who are largely within the same tradition here.
By the way, the New Testament was assembled in the 1st century.
There is zero evidence for that, especially considering that some of the New Testament texts may not have even been written until either the way end of the 1st century or even into the beginning of the 2nd century. The earliest canon list we have, that from Marcion in the mid-2nd century, only included a version of Luke and a selection of Pauline texts. The Muratorian fragment, also thought to be mid to late 2nd century, has many of our New Testament books, but not all of them, and also included was the Apocalypse of Peter. We can also look at Eusebius in the 4th century and see that he breaks down the debate as to what is and is not scripture, showing that there are some things that are universally accepted, but not everything is accepted by all of these individuals. There's some books that are just accepted by most of them, and then there's other books that are largely rejected, but still accepted by some. If this isn't a clear sign that there was no formalized canon, I don't know what more you would want. But if the canon wasn't formalized by the 4th century, it definitely wasn't formalized or closed in the 1st century.
Not at the Council of Trent, or the Council of Nicaea, rather.
He's at least right here. The canon was not formalized or assembled at the Council of Nicaea. The canon really wasn't even debated or discussed at this council. The idea that it was is a modern myth that was popularized by Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, even though it was already circulating before that. But what is interesting for this discussion is that Constantine did seem to commission some copies of the Bible, and we may actually have a couple copies of these in the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. It's not definitive that these are copies commissioned by Constantine, but it is quite probable. Either way, these texts come from that time period, and what we see is that they contain much of the Septuagint, meaning they have the Deuterocanonical books, and even had additions to the New Testament. Now, to be clear, these two manuscripts do differ a bit, but what they show us is that they have an extended Old Testament, and then with the New Testament they contain books that we just don't see as scripture today, which really just continues to reinforce the point that I've been making. There was considerable debate, and we don't see a standardized form until long after the books were written.
No, the 1st century, the church understood the books.
What church? Where's the evidence for this claim? Because we don't have a canon list in the 1st century. We don't have any church fathers claiming that this is what constitutes the canon, and there was quite a bit of debate that was going on. This is simply factually wrong and shows a complete disregard for history.
We've actually got the literature where people are saying these are the books that were written by the authorized sources.
Again, where? Where is this literature? Because when it comes to early Christian writings outside of the Bible, we have almost nothing. There is 1 Clement, but it doesn't spell out what was authorized or not, and in fact was often seen as scripture itself. We have the Didache and possibly the Shepherd of Hermas, but again, there's no mention of what is meant to be scripture here, no authorized list of what is canonical, and again, they were often seen as scripture themselves. We don't get a canon list until the mid-2nd century, and that isn't seen as authoritative. It's one view among many other views that would be put forth. And what we have to remember about this first canon list is that it was actually composed by a heretic, Marcion. So really, when we look at all of this, there simply is no historical backing for this individual's claims.
It was the Roman Catholic Church that actually added books to the Bible. not the Protestants.
Sure, the Protestants didn't add anything to the Bible, they just removed text from it, text that had been debated since the beginning. So they didn't remove anything that was necessarily seen as scripture, but instead they, in the 19th century, removed some books that had been debated for a very long time as to whether or not they were scripture. But the Catholics didn't really add anything either, at least not in a real meaningful way. I mean, since the Bible didn't exist at one point, someone had to put books in a list that would eventually become the Bible, but I don't think most would have an objection there. So the whole language of adding or removing books here needs to be rethought because it often misses the actual point. With that said, Catholics didn't add, in any meaningful way, books to the Bible. They didn't add the Deuterocanonical books to the Bible. Instead, they took the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and used this as a base. They removed a few books from it over time, and then debated a number of other possibilities for what seems like forever. A similar thing happened with the New Testament. You have a variety of different churches who have collected various books, who find different books useful, and eventually, after debates, discussions, consolidations, and the like, you get the New Testament. It's something that took centuries to be shaped, largely based on what people found useful.
I think that's a fair treatment of history.
What he has shown is that he has no clue about the history here. He's either making things up, or his research was so poor that he might as well be making things up. This is why you shouldn't talk about history if you're not willing to actually do any research.
Unless, of course, you're Roman Catholic, then you'll probably see it a bit different.
I'm not Catholic, but I do see it differently, because I care about this history. I've done the research. Now, I debate this topic with Catholics quite a bit, because I often disagree with their tradition on this as well, so his dismissal here would just be silly. The fact of the matter is that this individual has not done any proper research on this topic. When we look at the history, we see a very messy picture, one where we don't actually get a clear view of what the Bible really is until at least the late 4th century, and even then, it's still fuzzy. It would remain fuzzy for another 1,000 years, and even after that, after the Protestant Reformation, there was still a few threads that would not really be cleaned up until the 19th century. The Protestant canon as we know it is relatively modern, and that's fine. It doesn't necessarily subtract from it. It just means that it took time for full agreement. And what we do have to remember here is that even though this process took forever, there were still core texts that were accepted from almost the beginning. It's largely just the edges that had to be refined over the years.